Husband faked cancer to leave me. Karma gave him real cancer asterisk. Hey beautiful souls. I'm Christina, and I'm about to tell you the most insane karma story that literally proves the universe has a sense of justice. My husband of 11 years faked having terminal cancer to manipulate me into an easy divorce so he could marry his 25-year-old coworker. He fooled our entire family, our friends, and even medical professionals with his elaborate scheme. But here's where karma stepped in with the most poetic justice you've ever heard. 6 months after his fake cancer divorce, my ex-husband was diagnosed with real cancer. Asterisk by the time the universe was finished with him. My lying ex-husband lost his young girlfriend, his job, his savings, his health, and his dignity. While I got everything in our divorce settlement plus a $400,000 lawsuit victory. Oh, and his fake cancer scheme made national news and destroyed his entire family's reputation. This story has absolutely everything. Medical fraud, elaborate deception, workplace affairs, family destruction, and the kind of cosmic justice that makes you believe in karma. Y'all ready for this wild ride? Because this is how one man's fake cancer scheme led to real consequences he never saw coming. All right, gorgeous souls. Let me paint you a picture of what my life looked like before my husband decided to fake terminal cancer to get out of our marriage. I'm 34 years old, and up until 8 months ago, I thought I was married to this amazing, successful man who loved me unconditionally. My husband Derek was a pharmaceutical sales representative who made really good money, about $150,000 a year. Selling medications to hospitals and doctors' offices across Northern California. We lived in this beautiful 4-bedroom house in Sacramento that we'd bought 3 years ago, and I worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center. Together, we were pulling in about $220,000 a year, and we seemed to have this perfect, suburban life. Derek and I had been married for 11 years, together for 13 total, and everyone always said we were the ideal couple. He was charming, successful, always dressed professionally, and seemed completely devoted to our marriage. We didn't have kids yet because we'd been focused on building our careers and paying off student loans. But we'd been talking about starting a family soon. Derek always said he wanted to be financially stable before we had children. Derek traveled a lot for work, visiting hospitals and medical practices throughout his territory. But he was great about staying in touch and always brought me thoughtful gifts from his business trips. About 2 years ago, Derek got promoted to a senior sales position that came with a much larger territory and a significant raise. His new job required even more travel. One of those new hires was Brittany Chen, a 25-year-old recent college graduate who Derek described as incredibly motivated and eager to learn the pharmaceutical industry. Derek started mentioning Brittany frequently in his work stories, talking about how impressed he was with her sales techniques and how she had natural talent for building relationships with medical professionals. Brittany sold more in her first month than some reps sell in 6 months, Derek would tell me. She's going to be incredibly successful in this industry at first. I was happy that Derek had found such a promising mentee. He'd always been passionate about his work, and having an enthusiastic team member seemed to energize him. But over the months, Derek's mentions of Brittany became more frequent and more personal. He'd talk about her opinions on everything from industry trends to restaurant recommendations to vacation destinations. Around the same time Derek started working with Brittany, I noticed some significant changes in his behavior and our relationship. Derek became much more concerned about his appearance, joining an expensive gym, buying new clothes, and even getting professional teeth whitening done. I need to look more professional for these high-level client meetings, he'd explain when I'd comment on his increased spending on grooming and fashion. Derek also started working much longer hours and traveling more frequently. What used to be 2 or 3 overnight trips per month became weekly travel, sometimes lasting 3 or 4 days. When I'd express concern about his increased absence, Derek would get defensive and say things like, "This promotion requires more commitment than my old job. If you want to maintain our lifestyle, you need to support my career advancement." Most concerning was that Derek started becoming critical of our marriage and our life together. He'd make comments about how boring our routine had become and how he felt like we were just going through the motions. We need to think about whether we're actually happy or just comfortable. Frequent relationship talks about 6 months ago. Derek started complaining about various health issues that seemed to come out of nowhere. It started with headaches and fatigue. Derek would come home from work saying he felt completely drained and had been having severe headaches throughout the day. Then he started mentioning stomach problems, loss of appetite, and difficulty sleeping. Derek began losing weight, claiming he just couldn't keep food down and felt nauseous most of the time. As a healthcare professional, I was concerned about Derek's symptoms and encouraged him to see a doctor, but Derek kept putting off medical appointments, saying he was too busy with work and that it was probably just stress from the new position. I'll go to the doctor when things calm down at work, Derek would say whenever I pressed him about his health. But Derek's symptoms seemed to be getting progressively worse. He started calling in sick to work occasionally, which was completely unlike him, since he'd always been incredibly dedicated to his job. Finally, after weeks of my nagging, Derek agreed to see a doctor about his symptoms. Derek chose a doctor in San Francisco about 2 hours from our home, claiming he wanted to see a specialist rather than our local family physician. I want someone who really understands complex medical conditions, Derek explained. If something serious is wrong, I want the best possible care. Derek started making regular trips to San Francisco for medical appointments, sometimes staying overnight for extensive testing that required multiple days. Derek would come home looking worried and stressed, but he was vague about what the doctors were telling him. They're running more tests, Derek would say. The doctor wants to rule out some serious possibilities before giving me a diagnosis. When I offered to come with him to appointments for support, Derek always declined, saying the appointments were during work hours and he didn't want me to miss work for probably nothing serious. About 4 months ago, Derek came home from a San Francisco appointment looking absolutely devastated. He sat me down and, with tears in his eyes, told me that the doctors had found aggressive tumors and that he had been diagnosed with stage 3 pancreatic cancer. The doctor says I have maybe 18 months to live, possibly less depending on how I respond to treatment, Derek said while crying. I was absolutely shocked and heartbroken. Pancreatic cancer is incredibly serious and the survival rates are terrifying. I immediately went into caregiver mode, wanting to understand his treatment options and how I could support him. But Derek was resistant to my involvement in his medical care. He said he needed to process this privately and that he'd share information when he was ready. I need to handle this my own way, Derek told me. Having you at appointments would make everything more emotional and harder for me to cope with. Derek also insisted that we keep his diagnosis private from family and friends until he figured out his treatment plan. Y'all, watching my husband go through what I thought was terminal cancer was absolutely heartbreaking. But what I didn't know was that every single moment of his illness was completely fake and designed to manipulate me into giving him everything he wanted. Derek told me that his oncologist in San Francisco had recommended an aggressive treatment plan that would include chemotherapy, radiation, and possibly surgery if the tumors responded well to treatment. He started making regular trips to San Francisco for what he called chemo sessions, usually staying overnight because the treatments were supposedly so intense that he needed time to recover before driving home. Derek would come back from these fake treatments looking genuinely exhausted and sick. He'd spend the next day or two in bed, claiming the chemotherapy was making him nauseous and weak. Looking back, I realized Derek was probably just making himself sick by not eating or sleeping properly before coming home, so he'd look convincingly ill. Derek also started losing his hair, which I thought was from chemotherapy but later learned was because he'd been shaving it off gradually to simulate hair loss from cancer treatment. The attention to detail in Derek's deception was honestly incredible and terrifying. Derek used his fake cancer diagnosis to start making major changes to our finances and legal arrangements. I need to make sure you're protected if something happens to me. Derek told me about a month after his diagnosis. Derek insisted that we update our wills, life insurance policies, and financial accounts to make everything easier for you to manage when I'm gone. But the changes Derek suggested weren't actually protective of me. They were designed to give him maximum control over our assets before he disappeared from my life. Derek convinced me to sign papers that gave him sole authority over our investment accounts, claiming it would simplify estate planning if everything was under one name. He also suggested that we sell our house and move to a smaller place, arguing that I'd want something more manageable after he died, and that we could use the equity to pay for his medical expenses. At the time, all of this seemed like responsible planning from a dying husband who was trying to take care of his wife's future. But the worst part of Derek's fake cancer scheme was how he used his supposed terminal illness to emotionally manipulate me into accepting the end of our marriage. Derek started having deep conversations about our relationship and what would happen after he was gone. I've been thinking about what I want for you after I die, Derek would say. I don't want you to spend years grieving and being alone. I want you to find someone new and be happy. Derek also started suggesting that maybe we should separate for a while, so I could start adjusting to life without him before he actually died. It might be easier for both of us if we start living independently now, Derek argued. That way, when the cancer progresses, you'll already be established in your own life. Derek claimed that staying married while he was dying would be too painful for both of us, and that divorce might actually be the kindest option. I was horrified by these suggestions. but Derek was persistent and persuasive. He made it seem like divorce was actually an act of love and consideration for my future happiness. About 2 months after Derek's fake diagnosis, he started actively pressuring me to agree to divorce. I've been talking to other cancer patients, Derek told me, and many of them say that divorce actually reduced stress and allowed them to focus on treatment without worrying about their spouse's emotional burden. Derek presented divorce as something that would be beneficial for his health and recovery. He claimed that the stress of maintaining a marriage was interfering with his ability to fight the cancer. "If you really love me," Derek said, during one particularly manipulative conversation, "you'll give me the space I need to focus on getting better." Derek also started bringing up practical concerns about my financial future. "If he died while we were still married, if I die while we're married, you'll be responsible for all my medical debts," Derek told me, which was actually completely false. "If we divorce now, you'll be protected from those financial obligations." Derek had researched enough about medical bankruptcies and terminal illness to make his arguments sound plausible to someone who was emotionally devastated and not thinking clearly. After weeks of Derek's emotional manipulation and practical arguments, I finally agreed to proceed with divorce. I was heartbroken and confused. But Derek had convinced me that divorce was actually the loving thing to do for a dying spouse. "This doesn't mean we don't love each other," Derek assured me. "This just means we're being realistic about our situation and making smart decisions for both our futures." Derek insisted on using a mediator rather than separate lawyers, claiming that an amicable divorce would be less stressful for his health. The mediator Derek chose was someone he'd found who specialized in compassionate divorce for terminal illness situations. During our mediation sessions, Derek was incredibly generous with our asset division, which should have been a red flag, but actually convinced me that he really was thinking about my future welfare. Derek insisted that I keep our house, most of our savings, and his life insurance policy. He said he only wanted enough money to cover medical expenses and basic living costs for whatever time I have left at the time. Derek's generosity seemed like evidence of his love and concern for me. I didn't realize he was being generous, because he knew he wasn't actually dying and would soon have access to other resources. Our divorce was finalized about 3 months ago, exactly 2 months after Derek's fake cancer diagnosis. The whole process took less than 6 weeks because we'd used mediation and Derek had been so reasonable about everything. Derek moved out of our house and into a small apartment in Sacramento, claiming he wanted to be closer to his medical team in San Francisco. For the first few weeks after our divorce, Derek and I maintained contact because I was still concerned about his health and wanted to support him through his cancer treatment. But gradually, Derek became less communicative and more distant. He'd respond to my texts with short answers and rarely called to update me on his condition. "I need to focus on my health right now," Derek would say when I'd express concern about our decreased contact. "It's too emotional for me to maintain our friendship while I'm dealing with this illness." I was hurt by Derek's distance, but I respected his wishes and gave him the space he said he needed. Y'all, discovering that Derek had faked cancer to manipulate me into divorce was honestly more devastating than if he'd actually been dying, because at least death would have been something that happened to him, not something he chose to do to me. The truth started unraveling about 6 weeks after our divorce was finalized, and it happened completely by accident. I was at the grocery store one Tuesday evening when I ran into Janet Morrison, whose husband worked at the same pharmaceutical company as Derek. "Christina, how are you holding up?" Janet asked with this concerned expression. "Tom told me about Derek's situation, and I just want you to know we're thinking about you both." I assumed Janet was referring to Derek's cancer diagnosis. So I said something about how difficult the treatment had been, but that we were hopeful about his prognosis, but Janet looked confused. "Treatment? I thought Derek was taking time off for his honeymoon with that young woman from his sales team." My blood went cold. "What young woman? That girl, Brittany, something?" "Tom said Derek had been requesting vacation time for wedding planning and honeymoon trips. Didn't he tell you?" I stood there in the grocery store aisle, absolutely stunned as Janet realized she'd just revealed something I clearly didn't know about. Derek wasn't taking time off for cancer treatment. He was taking time off to plan a wedding to Brittany, his 25-year-old coworker. I drove home from the grocery store in complete shock, trying to process what Janet had told me. If Derek was planning to marry Brittany, then either his cancer diagnosis was fake, or he was getting married while dying, or something was seriously wrong with the timeline Janet had given me. I decided I needed to investigate Derek's medical claims more thoroughly. First, I called the oncology center in San Francisco where Derek claimed to be receiving treatment. When I explained that I was Derek's ex-wife and needed to verify his treatment schedule for insurance purposes, the receptionist told me they had no patient named Derek Williams in their system. I tried 3 other major cancer centers in San Francisco with the same result. No record of Derek ever being a patient. Next, I contacted Derek's health insurance company to review his claims history. As his ex-wife, I still had access to our joint insurance information for 30 days after our divorce. Derek's insurance records showed no claims for oncology visits, chemotherapy, radiation, or any cancer-related treatments whatsoever. The only medical expenses on Derek's insurance were for routine checkups with our family physician, which had ended about 8 months ago. Armed with this information, I decided to investigate Derek and Brittany's relationship more thoroughly. I created a fake social media account and started following Brittany's Instagram and Facebook profiles. What I found was absolutely devastating and infuriating. Brittany had been posting photos with Derek for months, but she'd been careful not to tag him or use his name in captions. There were pictures of them at romantic restaurants, on weekend trips to Napa Valley, and even photos from what was clearly a romantic vacation to Hawaii that had happened while Derek was supposedly undergoing chemotherapy. The Hawaii photos were posted just 3 weeks ago, with captions about the most amazing trip with my favorite person and living our best life together. In one photo, Derek was clearly healthy, tan, and happy, definitely not the appearance of someone undergoing aggressive cancer treatment. Most damning was a photo Brittany had posted just 2 days ago showing an engagement ring with the caption "He asked, and I said yes. Can't wait to start our forever together." Derek had gotten engaged to Brittany while I was still worried about his fake cancer diagnosis. I decided to confront Derek directly with the evidence I'd gathered. I called him and asked if we could meet for coffee because I wanted to check in on his health and see how his treatment was going. Derek agreed to meet me at a cafe near his apartment, probably thinking he could continue his fake cancer performance for a little longer. When Derek arrived at the cafe, he looked completely healthy. No weight loss, full head of hair, normal energy level. Nothing like someone undergoing chemotherapy. "Derek," I said, "I need to ask you something directly, and I want you to tell me the truth. Are you actually sick?" Derek's face went white, and I could see him calculating whether he could continue lying or if he'd been caught. "What do you mean?" he said, trying to buy time. Derek sat there for a long moment, and I could see him realize that his scheme had been discovered. Finally, he said, "Christina, it's complicated. I can explain everything. Explain how you faked cancer to manipulate me into divorce. Explain how you got engaged to Brittany while I was worried about your fake illness. Explain how you committed medical fraud and emotional abuse." Derek tried to minimize what he'd done. "I never meant for it to go this far. I just needed an easy way to end our marriage without a messy divorce. The cancer thing just made everything simpler." I was incredulous. "You let me believe you were dying? You let me grieve for you while you were planning a wedding to another woman?" Derek spent the next hour trying to justify his elaborate deception with the most pathetic excuses I'd ever heard. "Our marriage had been over 4 years, Derek claimed. "We were both just going through the motions. I did us both a favor by ending it cleanly. You could have just asked for a divorce like a normal person," I pointed out. "You never would have agreed to an amicable divorce," Derek argued. "You would have fought me on everything and made the process miserable for both of us. This way you could think our marriage ended because of circumstances beyond our control, not because I chose someone else over you." The level of manipulation and self-justification was absolutely breathtaking. Derek also tried to frame his fake cancer as something he'd done for my benefit. "I made sure you got the house and most of our assets. You're better off financially than if we'd had a traditional divorce." When I pointed out that he'd committed fraud and emotional abuse, Derek became defensive and angry. "It's your word against mine. And I'll just say I was confused about my diagnosis or that there was a miscommunication with my doctors." That's when I realized Derek thought he was going to get away with what he'd done to me. All right, gorgeous souls. This is where the universe decided to serve Derek the most poetic justice in the history of fake cancer schemes. Because, apparently, when you lie about having a terminal illness to destroy someone's life, karma comes for you hard. After my confrontation with Derek, I immediately contacted a lawyer who specialized in fraud and emotional distress cases. My attorney, Sandra Martinez, was absolutely fascinated by Derek's scheme and confident that we had multiple strong legal claims against him. "This isn't just divorce fraud," Sandra explained. "Your ex-husband committed intentional infliction of emotional distress, fraud, and potentially criminal impersonation of a medical patient. We filed a civil lawsuit against Derek demanding $200,000 for emotional distress and mental anguish, $150,000 for fraud and deception, $75,000 for costs related to his fake medical care. All attorney fees and court costs." We also reported Derek to his employer's ethics department, since using fake medical leave for personal vacations violated company policy. Additionally, we reported Derek to law enforcement for potential fraud charges related to his fake medical claims. Derek's reaction to the lawsuit was immediate panic, followed by desperate attempts to convince me to drop the case. He called me constantly, alternating between apologies, "I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you this badly," and threats, "If you pursue this, I'll make sure everyone knows you're just a vindictive ex-wife." When I wouldn't take his calls, Derek started showing up at my house and my workplace, begging me to be reasonable and move on from this. But Derek's problems were just beginning. His pharmaceutical company launched an internal investigation into his fake medical leave and discovered that Derek had been using company time and resources to plan his wedding to Brittany. Derek was fired for falsifying medical documentation and misusing company benefits. The company also demanded reimbursement for all the fake sick days and medical leave Derek had taken while planning his affair and fake cancer scheme. Meanwhile, Derek's engagement to Brittany imploded when she learned about his fake cancer scheme. When Brittany discovered that Derek had faked terminal illness to manipulate me into divorce, she was horrified and immediately broke off their engagement. "I can't marry someone who would lie about cancer," Brittany told mutual friends. "If he could fake something that serious, what else would he lie about?" Brittany also realized that Derek's fake cancer scheme could destroy her reputation in the pharmaceutical industry, since dating someone who impersonated a cancer patient while working in medical sales was a serious professional liability. Derek went from planning a wedding to being dumped and unemployed in the span of 2 weeks. But y'all, here's where karma stepped in with the most incredible twist of poetic justice. About 3 months after I filed my lawsuit against Derek, he started experiencing real health problems. Derek began having severe abdominal pain, weight loss, and digestive issues. Symptoms very similar to what he'd faked during his cancer scheme. At first, Derek ignored his symptoms, probably assuming they were stress-related from his legal and financial problems. But when Derek's symptoms persisted and worsened, he finally went to see a doctor. After extensive testing, Derek was diagnosed with stage 2 pancreatic cancer, the exact same type of cancer he'd faked to manipulate me. The irony was so incredible that when Derek's lawyer called to inform us about his diagnosis, Sandra and I initially thought it was another fake medical scheme, but Derek's new cancer diagnosis was thoroughly documented by multiple physicians and verified through extensive medical records. The universe had literally given Derek the exact disease he'd pretended to have. When Derek's real cancer diagnosis became known, he tried to use it to gain sympathy and get me to drop my lawsuit. Derek's lawyer argued that pursuing legal action against a genuinely ill man would be cruel and unnecessary. Derek himself called me crying and begged me to show mercy now that he was actually facing death. "I know what I did was wrong," Derek sobbed into the phone. "But now, I'm really sick, and I need all my money for medical treatment. Please don't take everything away from me when I'm already suffering." But I had absolutely zero sympathy for Derek's real illness after what he'd put me through with his fake one. "You made your choice when you decided to fake cancer," I told him. My lawsuit proceeded and was incredibly successful. The jury was actually more outraged by Derek's fake cancer scheme after learning he'd later developed real cancer, seeing it as proof that karma existed. The defendant's subsequent illness doesn't excuse his previous fraud and emotional abuse. The judge ruled, actions have consequences regardless of later circumstances. I was awarded $425,000 in damages, more than we'd originally requested, because the jury wanted to send a strong message about the seriousness of Derek's crimes. Derek was also ordered to pay all my attorney fees and court costs, bringing his total financial obligation to over $480,000. Derek's real cancer treatment, combined with his legal judgment, completely destroyed his financial life. Without health insurance from his job, Derek's medical bills quickly accumulated to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Derek had to sell his apartment, his car, and most of his possessions to pay for treatment and legal judgments. He moved back in with his elderly parents, who were humiliated by the scandal and struggled to afford his medical care. Derek's real cancer treatment was much more difficult than his fake version had been, leaving him genuinely weak, sick, and dependent on others. The irony of Derek actually experiencing the illness he'd faked was not lost on anyone in our community. Meanwhile, my life after Derek's fake cancer scheme has been incredibly positive and empowering. The lawsuit settlement allowed me to pay off my house completely and invest in my physical therapy practice. I also used Derek's story as the basis for a book about recognizing and recovering from emotional manipulation, which became a bestseller in the self-help category. The media attention from Derek's bizarre fake cancer scheme led to speaking opportunities where I help other people recognize manipulation and fraud in relationships. Most importantly, I learned that I'm much stronger and more resilient than I'd ever realized. and that sometimes the worst betrayals can lead to the most empowering new beginnings. Today, 2 years after Derek's fake cancer scheme, I'm living an amazing life in my beautiful house with my wonderful new partner, James, who's a physician who values honesty and integrity above everything else. Derek is still dealing with his real cancer treatment and the financial consequences of his fraud. His prognosis is uncertain, but his suffering is definitely real this time. Derek occasionally sends me messages asking for forgiveness or financial help, but I never respond. I learned that some people will literally fake terminal illness to get what they want. And those people don't deserve sympathy when karma eventually catches up with them. Sometimes the best revenge comes from the universe itself. When cosmic justice serves consequences that are more perfect than anything you could have planned. That's how you handle a husband who fakes cancer, y'all. You expose their fraud. Sue them for everything they're worth. And then watch karma give them the real disease they pretended to have. Derek thought he could fake his way out of our marriage and into a new life. Instead, his lies destroyed his health, his relationships, and his future. While making me stronger and wealthier than I'd ever been,